had never existed before. And that brought us everything about our globalized world with connections in finance and energy, manufacturing, multi-step, and all of it is from that decision that the Americans made. However, you play that forward and watch the demographic situation change. So as you urbanize, you have fewer kids, you do that for 70 years. It's not that you're running out of children. That happened 30, 40 years ago. We're now running out of adults, which means we're now at this moment where the old rules of the game are giving way. And the rules of whatever's next have yet to be created. And in this historical moment, this decade, maybe 2 decades, everything is in flux. And now is the time when the great men and women of history will leave their mark, because not all countries have all of the assets and positioning and demographic structure and resources that are the same as the others. And the ability to differentiate is huge. And so as events like the Ukraine war really build steam and break down or empower certain countries, this is when leaders can really leave their mark. This transition period allows certain places, led certain ways, to establish a new normal. And I think it's too soon to say that anyone is in particular going to be successful or fail at that, although we're probably going to know within the next few months. But I've got to say, the Biden administration has unimpressed me to this point, but now they're actually putting a few things in place that are likely to long outlast them, whether that's good or bad, of course, where you are.
What are you thinking of in particular?
One of the key tenets of globalization was the idea that the United States would trade security protection and economic access in exchange for allowing the United States to write your security policies vis-a-vis the Soviet Union and the Cold War. So as long as you let us call the big shots, you can have everything else that you need to run a modern economic system, and you don't have to fight for it. What we're seeing with the Biden administration is just the first piece of that. The security agreements are back on track.
Right.
But nothing about the economic access is. So I say this in a lot of places and it gets me in trouble everywhere. The 2 most similar foreign policy presidents we've ever had are Donald Trump and Barack Obama. And the 2 most serious economic policy presidents we've ever had are Donald Trump and Joe Biden.
2 most serious or similar?
Similar.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with you about the similitude between Obama and Trump. And people don't see it, but it is definitely there.
In the United States, for the first time since the 40s, we have an industrial policy. Now, we can argue whether that's more or less efficient, but at this time in history, having an industrial policy to complement what is going on with the global breakdown, that's really good timing. And as the Americans are oft to say, overkill is underrated. So just the amount of money that is being thrown at this is huge. And even if 3/4 of it is wasted, that is going to be enough to remake the American industrial space in a relatively autarkic direction at a time when global supply chains are breaking. That's fantastic if your goal is national power, which for Biden, just like for Trump, it is.
What of the post-war thesis that the United States would fare best in a peaceful world and that it was important to secure peace for its own sake on the grounds that lack of peace would inevitably in some way touch the United States? Do you think that we've abandoned that idea completely? Or do you really believe that we never believed that in the first place?
I think Americans believe that. I think it was right. I still believe that, but the people who believe my way in American policy have now lost in 8 straight presidential elections. Well, actually, I should say 7 straight. In this last one, we didn't even have anyone in the race. So our time has passed. And we are going to have to relearn some lessons. The reason we came to that conclusion is the devastation of the world wars was huge. And while it didn't hurt the Americans nearly as much as it hurt the Asians and the Europeans, it was still a Syrian experience for us. Well, it's been 2 generations, and there are not a lot of people who are still alive who remember any aspect of that, certainly not in a personal, visceral way. And so we're doing what we do every generation or 2, and we're shifting foreign policy into a more isolationist retrenchment position. The Ukraine war at present hasn't ended that.
I certainly agree that you can sense that there are no grandparents left telling people why our foreign policy should be the way it has been or the way it was after the Second World War. But do you not think that there are people who have studied it, the institutions are built to serve that it will continue in some form, just if nothing else, out of habit? I mean, you seem to have a United States that just drops off the face of the earth suddenly, right about now. And I don't see any indication that that's about to happen.
Excuse me, there are a lot of people who believe that way. There are a lot of people who have been in position of powers who would like to see that continue. They were almost to a person Republicans, and now they're known as rhinos. So the institution that kind of held that institutional zeitgeist, the Republican Party, is not what it once was. That's not something that I'm personally particularly thrilled with. I mean, I'm not a Republican, I'm an independent. I'm at home nowhere. What's the best way to phrase this? If you look at the sort of progress that needs to be made incrementally in order to maintain this sort of system, there are kind of two overarching international institutions that really matter. The first is the World Trade Organization, to keep chugging along on that effort to keep trade open as much as possible. We haven't had a new WTO round since 2001, and that one failed. We now have every major economic grouping or country moving in a protectionist direction. So the institutional inertia that I think you're arguing for here, which I normally have thought is a good thing, it hasn't been there for a while. And with the exception of a couple of tactical trade deals that were renegotiated under Trump, which were not minor, we haven't had meaningful progress on the trade front since the W administration. The second is going to be NATO. Now, NATO is absolutely getting a fresh lease on life. Everyone is supremely motivated at the time. And in the European space, this has been a godsend because we've just had this security disintegration is not quite the right word, but definitely an unraveling over the last 15 years. The French and especially the Germans have just had a completely different idea of what security means. I mean, we even had Angela Merkel, who considered herself relatively pro-American, arguing that we shouldn't measure defense in defense. We should measure it in development funds. And from a foreign policy point of view, there's something to be considered there. But from a defense point of view, that was kind of a little wonky. So that has come back from the brink, if you will. But we're just not seeing the mobilization in Europe that would be necessary for this to stick. It's not just that they're heavily reliant upon the United States. It's that the sort of societal shift that is necessary to get us back to where we were during the Cold War in terms of mindset. We just haven't tripped past that yet. There seems to be a general belief, especially in places like Germany, that this is going to stay in Ukraine. And as long as it stays in Ukraine, there is the option of going back to where we were 10 years ago. And I don't think it's really sunk in everywhere yet that that world is gone. Now, yesterday, 2 days ago, when the nuclear threats became explicit, that might be enough to push us over. We'll see, and we'll know soon.
They've been explicit since the beginning.